Eid Mubarak, and
Eid
welcome to
Mubarak.
our first Gen Con panel.
Yeah, once folks are in the chat, how are y'all doing?
All right. So I guess let's introduce ourselves. I'm Basheer Gauss, he, him. I'm a game developer and freelancer in the RPG industry. I've worked for quite a few companies, Paizo, Cobalt Press, Rowan and Rook, etc. And Ajey.
Yes, my name's Ajey. I use he, him pronouns. I am also a game designer. You might know me from never shutting up about Bolt. We'll save the plugs for later. You can also see me on Twitter. I review a bunch of games under the Ajay Reads hashtag. You may also have heard of me from the Tabletop Chop Shop hashtag, which is just weird, esoteric, not really esoteric, like weird game design threads on Twitter. Yeah, Austin.
Hi, my name is Austin McKenzie. I am the co-creator of Valor, which is a kind of shonen anime-styled game, and I also own Valor's Games, which is the extremely expensive publishing side of that endeavor. Beyond that, I just basically make games all the time.
Valor's incredible.
Instead of sleeping or eating, as you do.
Valor is so good. Like, everyone in the chat, you should get Valor. If you like anime nonsense, you will love Valor.
Absolutely, and of course, Bolt for the extremely quick cyberpunk.
All right,
cyberpunk
you get
nonsense.
one shot.
Speaking of Valor and Bolt, we've got our panel for today, Honesty in Game Design, or why is crunch good, or at least useful, for your games? Or at the very least, for your tables.
Yes. So I feel like crunch has like kind of been pulled into the discourse by a couple of prominent games that came out in like the past year, as well as a lot of discourse, the eternal undead discourse around crunch and math. Yeah, I think we should start with like, how can crunch be good? Like how can it really be build forward into a table? Basheer, you want to go start?
Yes, absolutely. So crunch is valuable for most games because it allows you to shape the experience and tone of playing your game. The mechanics you put in shape what people are trying to do and how they try to do it, which as a designer is your strongest tool for messing with their experience of the game and the product you have designed. So you have a lot of stuff in most games. You'll have some central engine that defines how players interact with literally everything in the game. In, say, Dread, which is extremely rules light, this is just the act of pulling blocks out of the Jenga tower and also the rules that surround it. Things like extra pulls and you die the moment it falls over, or you are in a doomed state the moment it falls over. In other games, it is more direct, especially in crunch heavy games, which I think is something I should turn over to you guys for.
Yeah, Austin, you want to dig into it a little bit?
Yeah. So for me, as I guess I'm the dirty capitalist here. Thinking ahead, like especially if you're someone who really wants to sell your game, crunch is the best way, in my opinion, to kind of set yourself apart. And I very much agree with what Basheer said in that designing your crunch is going to define that experience. So the way you make your game and the way those rules interact with how players play, how they build their characters, all of that is going to be absolutely defining in the feel, the flavor of everything your game does. So when we're talking crunch, I don't personally see it as a bad thing or anything like that, but the decisions you make can be good or bad, and I really say it's important to make crunch fit the feel of what you're trying to convey. Always, those rules should encourage certain play styles and certain flavor based on what you're trying to do.
Yeah. And for me, like the thing that sticks out to me to crunch is it's a way of making the players end up in the same like set of feelings as their characters. You know, if it's like, oh, that opponent of yours just took away half your hit points in one shot. Oh fuck. Like there's like I think there's Twitter thread that recently came up. Actually, I'll put it in the chat. By @BigStuffedCat, where what they did was they looked out 2 different ways that crunch can build into a game. We'll get to that question in a little bit. So actually, let's start with the question now. What do we mean by crunch? This is not about work crunch. We're talking about mechanical crunch, numbers crunchy. So a classical example of a crunchy game is Pathfinder, because there's a lot of numbers attached to it. There's a lot of calculation. The Pathfinder sheet that I was given when I looked into the game was a Google spreadsheet, because you have to do that much math to make it all play out. So that's what we mean by crunch.
Yeah. So
we're not going to imply that crunch at work is good.
Yeah.
We are not that kind of people.
Yeah, crunch at work is generally a bad thing.
Yeah.
Crunch in game design, as a one-line definition, refers to the hard and defined mechanics and systems that define how a game is played, especially those involving numbers, the calculation of numbers, and the effects those numbers have on play.
Yeah. And I think to go back to that thread by Big Stuff Cat, there are 2 ways that crunch can really add to your game. One is by the term they use is allied, to give you as a player options. So if you can kind of look at, here are what the numbers are. Here's what all of the mechanics specifically are. Here are my options for a given turn, for a given round of like, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. Here are the trade-offs. So in that way, crunch can allow clarity in terms of laying out what your options are in very clear terms. The other way is in terms of adding ritual of like, okay, we're in a big mech game, and we're gonna see what happens when I get super shot with a railgun and things break hard. So it's like, okay, we're out of HP. Then your online character sheet shakes. This is Lancer, for example. Your online character sheet shakes, and it's like, take structure damage. Roll 2d6. I rolled a 2. Oh no, my arm falls off. And there's a lot of like rules attached to it, but the rules are built out to make the process of losing an arm on your mech a big scary ritual. So there are 2 ways to look at crunch: is like either building into tone or in making options clear. Also, I will note that deep lore in your games is also crunch. So if your game requires an understanding of all of Middle Earth, I'll call that a crunchy game, even if there are no dice involved. If it requires understanding a lot of narrative lore, that's still kind of crunch.
I think it's worth noting too, since we brought up earlier kind of that
just
dichotomy.
For the audience, could we get like short definition of deep lore, as it were, especially as that's something that its definition can change by the person who's saying it or talking about it. So what might be deep lore to me and you might not be deep lore to a lot of the audience.
Sure. So let's give an example. Let's say I wanted to run a Star Wars game. And I wanted to run a mystery Star Wars game of like, you're gonna go out and like be these gumshoes out in Tatooine. And let's say I wanted to be that guy and say, all the information you need will either come from interviews or from anything that is on the legends section of Wikipedia. All of a sudden, that's a crunchy game because it requires a lot of deep background knowledge that in the same way adds to the ritual of you have to know what you're doing, you have to do the research, you have to take notes, but also in the adding options of like, oh, I know about this particular alien species in Star Wars. Here's how that might help to this game. And like numbers crunchiness, if it's done without a little bit of grace, then you're just going to confuse players. If you expect them to know or at least be able to research all of the Star Wars lore wiki to play your game.
Yeah, so I think that's a pretty solid working definition of like how deep lore works as crunch. It's something I think we'll get into more when we talk about like accessibility and examples. Um and I guess the crux of this is kind of about how you can use this in games that you're developing or in games that you're playing. And personally, I've always found that the key to that has kind of been intentionality and knowing
Yes.
exactly what you want all the bits of crunch to do in your game. Austin, did you have something you wanted to mention
Yeah,
there?
I absolutely agree. Intentionality, and that kind of comes back to my original point, right? Where it's, the way you design it is going to define how it feels. So I'll use my own game as an example for Valor. One of the big things we were trying to focus on is that feeling of like in the kind of the shonen seinen genre, for those who are familiar, kind of the action and like Magic High School, stuff like that. A lot of what you expect in that genre is like people screaming about friendship and love while they're shooting lasers out of their swords, and um, dramatic monologues by some big bad who just revealed his master plan. All of that, we wanted to make sure that the rules encouraged you to do that. So our decision was that we would create a stat, which we named after the system itself, or we named the system after the stat more accurately, called Valor, where if you do things like that, if you shout attack names at the table, if you know, deliver dramatic monologues and like cry about how your mentor is dead and you need revenge or whatever, you will gain valor, which you can then use to boost your character and your roles. And that was very specific to the idea that our rules need to reflect and encourage a behavior. And behaviors, this kind of role play is something you don't necessarily define by the hard and fast crunch rules. So we had to find a way to tie together that kind of more nebulous role play aspect with hard numbers.
Mm-hmm. And like, I think starting with what do you want the crunch to do is a really good place to start. Of like, the way I think of it, at least, is if you're going to add rules to a game, there should be a reason they're there, both on a gameplay side and on a narrative side. And if you can't give a clear answer of like what this mechanic does for the table, you kind of don't need it. Like I think a good way to start is like, what do your characters do? What do characters do in your game? And then more importantly, what don't they do? Or what are they bad at? Go ahead. Basheer?
I think so. An important caveat to that, or at least in how I approach game design, is what do the characters need to go to your resolution mechanic to deal with?
Mm.
Because even in games where your characters are doing a lot of like negotiating or having fun in town or whatever, you may well not need any crunch for that if it doesn't add anything to your game. So if it, on the other hand, if you're doing something like flying circus, where like blowing off the stress you accumulated in the combat phases is important, then you do want crunch for what's happening in town. On the other hand, if you're doing something like a traditional Pathfinder or D&D or quest game where you're doing a lot of stuff in town and that's where an enormous amount of the plot happens, but it's something that the rules don't care to mechanize much, even though that's something characters are doing, even though it's something characters might be good at, you don't need much, if any, crunch for it. It's why so many of these games kind of simplify stuff happening outside of the focus or in social situations to like roll something basic, figure out if that's good or bad.
Yeah. Another good example of that is Lancer, where the actual combat in the mech is big, it's complicated. You feel like you're in a giant, like hefty mech with a bajillion things going on.
Very crunchy.
But if you want to get into a bar fight, you just apply fists to faces, roll d20, and see what happens.
Yep.
Because, frankly, getting into a bar fight isn't the point of Lancer. And the d20 is there to basically be like, fuck around and find out.
I will say though, I do think it is worthwhile to consider in that experience, like Basheer was saying. One of the things, and I try not to shit on people's systems, but I will offer this criticism to D&D specifically. The way D&D was set up is you are supposed to derive a lot of engagement from those town sequences of going to the tavern, getting the quest from cryptic sages and all of that other fun stuff. And if that's something that you in the design of your system are expecting players to engage with on at regular level and to really draw a lot of entertainment from, I think it behooves you to make rewarding crunch, make rules that foster that relationship and make players want to feel like they can define it.
I'm going to
okay, go ahead.
Just finish your thought. I don't want to interrupt.
Yeah. Really, at the end of the day, it's important to understand the kind of experience you're developing for. Because if there is something that is going to be a large segment of your game, and you are trying to make a game with a rules focus, you should definitely look at that segment and make sure that you've given appropriate consideration to what kind of definition you need to make those sections feel right.
So I am going to disagree on the idea that everything that specifically on like the D&D town sequence, which I think also applies to what Ajey said about the like Lancer out of combat sequences, in that even if you expect players to engage with something and derive pleasure from it, you don't necessarily need to have heavy crunch there if that's not the sort of thing you want to have mechanical incentives for. So Lancer has pretty loose out of mech rules taken in large part from Powered by the Apocalypse, because even though the out of mech stuff is important and is a driving part of any mech game and the genre, it's not something that needs the level of mechanical engagement that the in mech sequences have. Similarly, in D&D or Pathfinder or Quest, you still have the expectation that these out of combat and out of exploration sequences are important and are something that's going to drive the plot, and that players are going to derive some level of benefit or joy from. But there is no such there isn't an expectation that it's something that needs to be heavily mechanically driven. The game trusts that this is something that the group will handle on its own with some rough guidelines.
Yeah.
And like Lancer has a better definition of success and failure on individual roles, whereas D&D trends pretty loose on it outside of combat. But they have basically the same approach to those out of combat, and in the case of D&D, out of exploration sequences.
And another thing to keep in mind, not only is like about like enjoyment of like a particular set of rules, is the amount of like rules depth involved in a game or in a section of a game that will correlate to how long that part of the game will take. So if you want a bar fight to take an entire session, bring out your Pathfinder stuff, and you will have a bar fight that takes hours. If you don't care, in Flying Circus, it's one roll. It's one roll to fuck around and find out, and then it's like, okay, you can cut to the end of the bar fight where everyone's beat up, and you're not going to lose anything. That's another part of it, is like the longer you want a thing to take, the more rules you'll attach to it.
Yep.
Otherwise, if you want things to go quickly, simplify the rules.
Yeah, crunch heavily defines how much time investment players have in a thing. So most games with combat will have a lot of crunch around combat because that is something, purposefully or not, in the case of some games, that they want to take a long time and to be a significant chunk, if not the majority, of gaming time.
And by contrast, a game like Masks or Monster Hearts, they're not considered crunchy game, but there's a lot of crunch. There's a lot of mechanical depth to relationships and social interaction. Or if you play a game like Visigoths versus Molgoths, there's a whole web of like NPC interaction in the back of the book that the game master is handling, and that the players are expected to kind of at least figure out a little bit of. Like, that's its own kind of crunch, because that's the kind of game that Visigoths versus Molgoths is trying to tell, of like teens getting up to nonsense and having these interconnected personal webs. Whereas, like, you can have a skill in spears, but you're just gonna roll.
Yeah.
You're gonna roll to use spears. Like, that's not why you're playing Visigoths versus Molgoths or Masks or Monster Hearts.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Especially Visigoths versus Molgoths is an excellent example in that the crunch it has is focused towards creating teenage shenanigans in malls, basically, and around malls and in mall adjacent scenes.
I think it's only in the mall. I think it's like in like a hyperspace thing. You can't actually.
By the rules, it's, I think, supposed to entirely be in the mall.
Yeah.
But like, the play I have seen inexplicably gets slightly outside of the mall on a regular basis. But yeah, let's see, which I believe is, so yeah, to, I guess, kind of sum up our how to approach crunch thing, it's kind of, you define what characters are doing and how much time you want them to be doing it. You figure out what the goal of the crunch is. Like, is this setting a tone with things like random critical tables, for example, from Dark Heresy, often set a kind of grim comedic tone because the crunch of the game is showing you these random ways people are exploding hilariously in the middle of the fight, and like detached limbs are going off and taking out other combatants entirely. And it's gruesome and it's kind of inherently hilarious.
It's Warhammer.
Yeah, it's very Warhammer.
Matthias Gwax brings up, like, I think lack of mechanics is also a statement in the game design, in terms of like, what does the game designer intentionally leave to the players? And I think that's a good point.
Yes, that's really great phrasing. I love that.
Like, for example, keep going back to Flying Circus. The base move of Flying Circus is just push your luck. There's no roll. You just do it, and then the game master like fucks with you in some way. And like, that's an example of like that player agency, because the writer wants you to get into nonsense and do it, and then face the consequences. Yeah. So there's no role to like fail to do the thing. You just do it, and the consequences.
Player agency,
yeah,
is a great line.
It's a great line. Kudos.
Yeah, I know. Looking at this kind of thing, when I'm looking at it, I tend to ask the question of your system's core engagement, right? Which I think is kind of what we were talking about, where when you're defining kind of those points where you want to put your crunch in, it's what are you really trying to accomplish with this game? Where do you want your players to spend your time? What is the base engagement? Where is that coming from? Where are they going to really be having their fun? Where are they really going to be, when in the ideal state of this game, what are they doing? That's your core engagement.
Yeah, exactly. That's solid. And yeah, that's very much like what crunch helps define. And I think, are we good to start talking about accessibility? Is there
I
anything
think
else
we're
you
good.
want to
Yeah, yeah.
cover here? All right. Ajey, take us away.
Yes, accessibility. It is not just about screen reader accessibility and like proper font selection. It's also in how you describe your rules. It's in like the order you describe rules. It's in the language you use. It's in like examples that you give. Like giving examples and how they're phrased is really important. And also it's like just clarity. Um, like I think one of the funniest lines that I heard about Shadowrun was in the Neoscum podcast where Casey Tony at one point was like, here, yeah, I have this particular question. Can you look up the 6 different places that this answer could be in? Like, and that's an indictment of the way Shadowrun, the book, is organized. Like, that's inaccessible design. Because if you don't know where the clarification for a set of rules is.
Yeah, crunch is really one of the places where if you are not careful, you will start running into accessibility issues because things will become hard to reference, they will become hard to remember, they will not be they will not be easy to interpret by people who aren't you, which is one of the first things I think people run into when they start getting into game design is like, I have this great idea for a game. How do I write it so that people who aren't me can run it? Which is the core of a lot of accessibility issues.
And it's also a place where you can learn a lot from how software designers do their stuff, of like properly labeling your functions, properly documenting your code, properly labeling your files, and giving good variable names, and like being clear with like white space and bracketing. Like there are a lot of things you can do to improve readability of code and improve capacity to like follow it, both on the structure and also on the documentation organization. And the same applies to games. Like I think one thing to really like hammer home on is like you lead with like the language you use for the game, because if you're gonna have a complicated enough game, there's gonna be a specific language to it. Like with 5e, like you have to get people to understand like proficiencies, stats, skills, saving throws, advantage and disadvantage, like class abilities, feats. Like there's a lot of language to D&D um, that you don't really notice this kind of ubiquitous, but you can kind of hear it when you hear people talk about people who are like used to like 3.5. They'll often call things bluff checks because that's the language of 3.5 that they're having to port to 5e. Like that's what I'm talking about. Of like, you have to get people on the right page in terms of like what are the specific words associated with this? Like, what is skullduggery in the case of Genesis? That kind of thing.
Yeah, what is covered by what's the difference between vigilance and cool in if you're playing the Fantasy Flight Star Wars games? Like, when do I use one versus the other? It's not necessarily going to be clear unless you explain it, which is going to be the case for a lot of mechanics. And that's very much on you as the designer to handle. You can do it in a couple of ways. So, say something like Flying Circus or Lancer or 5e will have written out explanations of various things and what they mean. I think most Powered by the Apocalypse games will have some primer on this is what moves are, this is what holds are, things like that. Whereas, say, Quest does most of its accessibility work through formatting and layout in getting things onto clear to read one page spreads that read pretty intuitively, on having single spreads or single pages focused on a concept and teaching you how that concept functions within the context of this game. And that's which you choose, and like what other tools you choose, those aren't the only two approaches you have, are going to be up to you, but it's something you'll want to actively consider in the design of your game. especially if you're doing a very crunchy game like Valor's abilities and a lot of bolts, especially like kind of the subsystems like the Ace Combat one that you developed a bit ago.
Oh yeah, I can talk about that one. I think the thing that a lot of these really crunchy games do that is worth pointing out is that they lead with the core rules and don't talk about the subsystems and the character options until deep into the book. Like 5e will lead with like what the classes are, what the races and classes are, but they won't tell you how the game works until a little later because of details. But with Flying Circus or Lancer or even Valor, they'll lead with here are the core rules. Here's how combat works. Here's what turn order means. Here's what all the words mean. And then only once you have all of that will they let you talk about, okay, here's the stuff you signed up for. Here's the cool abilities. And that's really important because you have to kind of get the vegetables out before you can get to the fun stuff. But the vegetables are the prerequisites. It's the boring first year classes in college that you need to understand the interesting stuff later on.
And a good way to figure out this kind of, even on the formatting end, is playtesting. One of the ways we were able to achieve, anywhere near as well as we did is you have people read your text. You have
Pupper.
Yeah. But yeah, so you have people read your text. You have people try and play your game, and especially try and play your game with just what you've given them, without you saying anything. And that's really, especially if you're making any kind of modestly crunchy game, is going to set you apart. Is you got to spend a lot of time getting random people who hopefully like you, but don't necessarily need to spare your feelings, and have them demolish everything that you've made and hold dear right in front of you, and only then will you actually be able to see where you're falling down and fix it.
Yeah, like I think one of the most interesting playtesting sessions I had was on a stream game where someone else, not me, I was a player in the game. I was not playing Bolt. Someone else was I was playing Bolt. Someone else was GMing the game, and I was like, okay, here's an interesting thing. This person is playing this game in a way I did not expect. Like if I wanted to like talk, if I wanted to like speak up about it, I goes like, you're playing the game wrong. Do X, Y, Z, but I didn't. I just saw how the game played out, and that's useful information. Because it's a matter of, is the person confused by the game systems I wrote? Did they miss something? Or was that stuff not necessary? Or can the game run without it? Another thing to kind of bring up on accessibility is make your rules work if you're skimming. Because nobody is reading your text word for word. You are writing it word for word.
Nobody's reading your text word for word until something goes wrong and they're trying to figure out what they're trying to fix.
Oh yeah.
So as part of that, design your headings well. And if it's a thing that people need to read word for word, write it in big red letters. Like literally
Give it its own box.
Yeah, give it its own box. Like after reading a couple of reviews of Bolt being like, I don't get this skill, because it was like, oh, that's because you skipped XYZ. I can't let people skip that if this section is gonna make sense. Like I have to like making that call out of like these skills work different and make that call out. And that's an important part of like skimming. Especially like again, going back to code, good documentation is skimmable. This is what annoys me about Python libraries. Where were we? We're talking about playtesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I kind of agree with the point you made earlier, Ajey. One of the most valuable playtesting experiences I get on a regular basis is just have someone else play a game I've written or a module I've made or something, watch and say nothing the entire time. Just either get a text log afterwards or kind of sit in on a voice call in the background with my mic muted and just correct nothing, offer no help. if people get confused, they've got to deal with it themselves, and it will make the issues a lot clearer if you can do that a few times.
And also, like, having people just review your book, like hearing people like Nick Butler has read my book, Panda Theus on Twitter like has read through Bolt, and just I had no input in what they were saying about it, which is super helpful because it's like, oh, this is what stuck up to this person, this is what confused them, this is what gave them like bad vibes, you know, like that's useful like intel. You know, it's like people who, especially people who don't know you and don't give a damn if they make you mad, they'll give useful info.
Yeah, everything anyone can offer up, like there's going to be some use there. Well, okay, I won't say like everything, but a lot of what people are going to offer up there, there'll be use there, and especially too, it's good to get as broad a sample size as you want because you'll really hone in on the problems that people keep running into. You know, if a single group has an issue with a rule that you've made, there's always that hanging question. Well, was it just them or is it everybody? But if 3 out of 5 groups have this issue, then you've got a problem.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. Like repeating it and getting a wide sample of data is very useful. We've got another question in the chat. Some games put the crunch in the combat, some put it in social interaction within the game, sometimes at the expense of the other. Are there any games that you think spanned both aspects successfully? I've got an answer in mind, but I'd like to hear if you guys have any ideas.
I
Though
have
I'm
an answer
sure
as
me and
well.
Ajay are probably
Austin,
thinking of the same thing.
maybe not. Austin, what do you think?
I don't want to just turn this into me pimping my own game, but that's kind of what
You
we
should.
You should plug your own game.
but that was design wise what we strove for in Valor. We made a system. I call it the meter system, where even in what we call challenge scenes, where you're not fighting, you're still tracking variables via meter, where you define your action, and depending on how you go about doing something, that can determine bonuses or penalties to your role, where you're trying to influence all these different factors to bring them to a satisfying conclusion. And really, I think for a lot of those games that you want to have your fighting, but you also want to have your narrative cake too. It's just really important to kind of gamify, to bring crunch to both, to show that both aspects are important.
Yeah, that's solid. I'm glad to hear that about Valor. My personal answer was going to be Flying Circus, which I think does this very well. It has a very codified cycle system where you have like an air mission phase of the game, and then you have a town phase of the game, and both have pretty heavy crunch. In air combat, you're going and doing air combat, and in town, you're dealing with stress, you're dealing with vices, you're dealing with trying to run a company. Since it's basically a game about mercenary entrepreneurship, you're dealing with like labor relations and all of that stuff, finding new jobs, and it's a really well designed balance between combat crunch and social interaction crunch to give you plenty to spend time on in both phases of the game.
My take is that, all respect to Austin, trying to get very crunchy with both social interaction and with combat, unless you absolutely know what you're doing, it's a dangerous game to play.
Oh, absolutely.
Because what you end up doing if you make every part of your game crunchy is that every part of your game takes forever. And nothing, and if you're not smart about it, nothing happens because everything takes 3 hours.
That takes you back to the playtesting, though. It's how do you develop that crunch so that the game still flows? It's a lot of effort. I mean, we play tested for like 10 years, so it takes time. You can do it though, but I absolutely agree. It's dangerous path and dangerous territory to walk. So if you're going to do it, do it with intentionality.
Do it with 10 years of playtesting.
Yeah.
In terms of games that do combat and social interaction really well at the same time, honestly, my first thought is Airlock, which is not as crunchy. But what that game does very well is it makes combat and social interaction, like both like ship combat and like crew scenes and like intrigue scenes, all run in the same engine. And then having everything around it be narrative flavor, which is very cool. You should check out. I think a good example of it is actually this stream game called Hyperdrive First Ember. Welcome to the party. That is a very good example of what the airlock system can do at the hands of a really good GM. So that's one way to go about it, is to not write two systems for social and combat, and just to make one that like runs like a dream. What's up, Imani? Hi. Shout out to Imani for organizing so much for all of Gen Con for a bunch of people.
Oh yeah.
Imani, thank you so much. Matthews Guax is back with another question. I think we can just kind of roll into questions. What do we all think about punitive crunch as a way to direct the playing experience?
Was that? My chat's scrolling a bit slow, so I didn't hear.
Matthews, yeah, go ahead. Matthews in particular brought up like BX, like old school D&D as an example of like crunchy combat being used as a way to avoid doing combat because it will wreck you. Yeah, Mr. What do you got?
I really like punitive crunch, at least in concept. A lot of the time, it's something you need to be careful with, because if you don't signpost it well, or you don't make it clear that this is what's up with your game, you can get something that's just kind of a miserable experience for everyone, because punitive crunch is something people need to be in on before they start. As a game with punitive crunch, if you don't know what you're looking at, it just looks like a combat system. And if you aren't good at reading a system on the fly, which most people aren't, you can go, okay, this is a cool combat crawl game, and that lasts until your first encounter and everyone's miserable. And like, some editions and splats in Exalted are like this, for example, and some splats in New World of Darkness are in practical terms like this, just to take big budget games as examples, where like in World of Darkness, the most rules by far go into how fighting works. Also, for almost all splats, fights are knife fights in alleys and maybe one person is walking out alive. Everyone's getting fucked up the moment you start getting hit, and you are going to start getting hit. And it's not something it signposts well. So one of the complaints you see, and one of the complaints that are occasionally earned by New World of Darkness games, is that, this game doesn't really do what I was expecting it to do. But when it does work, you get things like a lot of the OSR scene, where the combat system basically turns into a puzzle system, or a World of Darkness game at its best, where the combat system is an incentive not to go into combat, or an incentive to adjust how going into combat ends up being. Like, make sure you're engaging on your terms, make sure you've prepared for this, etc. And that can create really incredible experiences. And punitive crunch is really good at setting tones, be it dark or comedy.
Like, I think a good example of it, actually there are two good examples I'll bring up. The first is Cyberpunk 2020, which has very crunchy, very dangerous gameplay in terms of combat. But what they do is they say that up front of like, you're going to be playing a combat system where no one knows how to use the guns they're holding, and everyone gets shot. And all the sidebars are literally like, here are dirty bastard underhanded tactics you can use. So like get the drop on people, put a claymore on the bed where they sleep. Oh, you've trapped them into a room, put a trap door and an explosive on the door so they can't leave without getting blown up. Like, be underhanded, don't use the combat system, you will die. Unless you're a solo, in which case everyone else will die. And they say that too, of like the solo is overpowered. But they also they signpost that up front, and they're very intentional about it. Another example is Troika, with their initiative system, where they literally call out that the way the initiative system works, they will literally call out that sometimes your character will just forget to take a turn on this round. And that's just kind of how the game works. And it's like, they bring that up. It's like, listen, you're playing a lawyer whose skills are all in swords. What do you expect? This is a bullshit nonsense game. So if you're gonna have punishing combat, whether for horror or grit or for comedy, you should signpost it. Because I think Dark Souls also had that issue of like, they don't tell you that you're supposed to die a bunch, that dying isn't a bad thing. And people get discouraged because they keep dying. And they don't really say, oh, they try and signpost it by insta-killing you in almost every game to start. But like, that's part of the signposting, is like telling people, here's what to expect, here's how you beat it. And if you can't beat it, maybe that's the point. Maybe you're playing a horror game. The point is that you're going to be doomed, you know. But you have to set the expectations for the players, especially if you're not going for make all of it fun.
Mm-hmm.
And this really ties back into that earlier conversation about intentionality. You need to make clear what it is. Personally, in my opinion, if you are utilizing punitive crunch, I do think that there should be other crunch that isn't, so that can even non-verbally, although you should again telegraph it verbally, but through that there should be pleasant crunch that provides a clear dichotomy, or well, pleasant, not necessarily pleasant, but crunch that feels good to the game. So like for horror, like none of that's necessarily going to be pleasant, but if you're playing it right, it should feel right, if that makes sense. Where it's very clear if you've gotten into that punitive crunch zone where it's like, okay, this is going badly, even just looking at these rules. But if we're playing kind of along that path of what we're trying to accomplish, okay, this makes sense, it's flowing, I got it.
Like, a good example is actually Resident Evil 4, of like, if you're rather new to the game, it's terrifying. Everything comes at you with a chainsaw. But if you're good at the game, it looks more like Die Hard, you know? Like, you become the action movie badass through mastery of the system, you know? Or even in like,
definitely became that, yeah.
Or like, even like Resident Evil 4, like if you're good at it, you can there's an arcade mode. Or even in like a game like Dark Souls, you get wrecked a bunch if you're rather new, or if you're at a regular level. But then there are people who will just not get hit at all for the entire game, because you can do that too. So there's a way to win despite the punitive system. I think we should get into what we think are good examples of crunchy games, and then open it up to questions.
All right, yeah, that sounds like a plan. So let's see. So for examples of excellent crunchy games, we've talked about Lancer and Flying Circus a lot. Both are, I think, pretty excellent examples of crunchy games that know what they're doing and what they're trying to accomplish with their crunch. And so utilize that to great effect in gameplay.
Also, both of them have very good online tools to help you with that.
And rad art.
Fucking rad art. Like, you should just like tinker with CompCon, the Lancer tool, and just behold. Another good example of crunchy games, I'll put down like good nation games. Like Basheer's running a nation game with like 16 players. That's kind of crunch. I don't know what half the factions are doing. I don't really need to know, but it's happening. That's the kind of crunch. Also, we can kind of put in our plugs. I write Bolt with a kind of moderate crunch angle. Yes, Amani, I will play Lancer with you. Call me, hit me up.
Yeah, just schedule a time. I will clear out pretty much any non-Lancer game I'm in to get into a Lancer game. Like,
I'm just gonna bring out a Harrison beefy boy. Austin, what about you?
Yeah, I kind of let me commit some heresy here. There was a this is one of the big boys, and I am forever an apologist for it. But one of the things that really influenced me when I was starting to design and learning design was actually looking at what they did for Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition,
yeah.
because it was a very big departure from the core system, but you can see a lot of what they were trying to accomplish, and honestly, in my opinion, they succeeded at doing what they were working for. It wasn't what people wanted, and we kind of talked about that earlier, right? Where with World of Darkness, for example, and they kind of run into this problem too with New WoD, where there's a lot of expectations built on their older systems, and it's hard to bridge that gap. But as a case study, D&D 4 is fascinating in how they just tuned it very specifically to run quickly, to give everyone kind of a defined role and identity that is very readily apparent right off the bat. I think looking at and designing for crunch games is well worth at least a look.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we'll get into questions with like 10 minutes we have left. Scattering Light asks, any tips and suggestions on tweaking a crunchy system to focus on crunch that works for you and your gaming group?
So I think we actually have another panel on this later, but my personal favorite approach to this is to basically just steal crunch that I like from a different game and then bring that into the one I'm currently playing.
Yep.
Just
I did that for
steal
Genesis
systems outright.
Like, I stole shamelessly from Genesis and Cyberpunk 2020 when writing Bolt. Like, shameless. There's actually a great segue to the next panel that I think, Basheer, you're on as well, right? Or no?
I believe so. I am on the 7 I am on the 7 EST panel or EDT panel.
Yes, then you are also on that.
Yes.
It's called It's Not Generic, where we talk about literally this of like shamelessly stealing from existing games to
and
your
bolting
own
it onto your own system. Is that right?
To your own nefarious ends. Yeah. Yes.
Steal shamelessly though.
Bolt
Absolutely
has great art.
Shamelessly.
I am so happy with the artist for Bolt. Thank you for the shout out. Yeah, and Lancer's good. Lancer's very good. I want to play at some point. I feel like everyone wants to play Lancer, and then no one actually sets up the group chats.
I'm running a game of Lancer. I am blameless in this.
Everyone wishes we could be as lucky.
Just gotta pencil yourself in on Basheer's busy schedule. That seems to be the way to go.
Yeah, because I have a really fun Manticore build where I gave him like Nuclear Cavalier. I'm just gonna play like a deity, like super Christian type. Just roll in, set everyone on fire, screaming about fire and brimstone.
How do you new question. How do you crunch if you can't do math? Avoid math in your crunch. This is actually something that's very possible. It just requires a lot of work, since the crunch most of us are familiar with is stuff that involves math. But so the nation game I'm running, Karage Crisis, it doesn't have any dice rolling, and math is basically just counting what you have and then allocating that. There's a bunch of crunch revolving like how all of this stuff works, but it's basically what assets do you have as a subdivision of a nation state? How are you using those assets during this period of this political crisis?
And it's like, what are other people doing? Who wants to shoot you?
Yeah, pretty much.
In my case, everyone.
I'm in
this game.
Like, there are no numbers higher than 4 during the first turn of the game. And it's just addition and subtraction. Then, and for example, you can do stuff like that for anything more or less. It's just going to require more work. So you have games like Amber Diceless. You have games like Night's Black Agent, which kind of has this, you're just rolling the thing and then you can spend resources to increase the dice result. And stuff like that, where you have crunch and occasionally significant crunch, but it's not something that relies heavily on math or the mathematical skills of anyone in the group. This can often get bookkeeping heavy because the easiest thing to go to if you're not rolling dice for randomizers is to track resources to determine how things work. But you can get around that. There's a no Jenga tower hack of dread that's basically like you roll dice and then you mark off how much each time a certain result has come up, which doesn't require math and does crunch. Blades in the Dark doesn't really require math on your end, despite being a crunchy system for dice rolling, because it's just roll dice. Is any of them like 3 to 5? Is any of them a 6? Done.
And also, the other way to do crunch if you're not good at math is to make the computer do the math for you. This is how engineers do math, because here's the dirty secret about engineers. We're all crap at math. You ask an engineer to calculate a tip, they'll pull out their phone immediately. Like, make the computer do it for you. Red Wen's TV brings up, there's also narrative crunch that is something that tries to shape your actions and, fights you to go against it. They bring up Vampire the Masquerade, L5R. Absolutely.
I feel like Mage is really the example of the World of Darkness on that one, where Paradox will literally ruin your day.
I know nothing about World of Darkness. But yeah, absolutely. That is definitely a thing. Before we close out, because we've got a couple minutes left. Yes, show up to in an hour. Roll up for It's Not Generic, about hacking existing systems to your own nefarious ends for glorious game design powers. It's gonna be great. I think we're all gonna be on that panel and a couple more too.
Yeah, we're all there.
It's gonna be a great party.
We've got Amaraz. We've got, I don't think I know the last person on the panel,
John,
but
maybe?
it's going to be rad.
It's gonna be amazing. I'll be drunker next time. It's gonna be great. Let's roll up with plugs and then we'll wave goodbye to folks. Basheer, you want to go first?
All right. Hey, I'm Basheer Gauss. You can find me at twitter.com/Basheer Gauss. You can find the stuff I make at havocfet.itch.io. And I am available for freelance writing pretty much constantly. If you have a project you need some writing for, hire me. 10 cents a word. Or 30 an hour for cultural consulting. Or 30 bucks an hour for cultural consulting. But yeah.
Cool. My name's Ajey. You can find me on Twitter at Ajey Pandey. You also check out the Tabletop Chop Shop hashtag, which everyone can tweet through. Tweet about Tabletop Chop Shop. You can find me there or through the Ajey Reads hashtag, where I review other people's games and kind of break down their mechanics and see how they tick. I am also the Bolt Man. I write nothing but Bolt hacks these days. Expect Bolt itself to get kickstarted around like September. There's no official date yet, but it's gonna be September.
Good luck.
It's gonna be wild. I am keeping the scope very focused to start. The art's gonna be amazing though. So check that out. Follow the Bolt Twitter at BoltRPG @BoltRPG. I've also been working on a fun like jet fighter hack Bolt, which is going to be coming out relatively soon. I'm excited. Austin?
Yeah, Austin McKenzie. You can find me at valorisgames.com, which is our core site, or through our official Twitter at Valorous Games. Or you can, if you really want to see me be perennially bad at Twitter, you can follow me on at Valor Austin. But yeah, I do Valor all the time. I talk about Valor. I eat it. I breathe it. I sleep it.
It's a good fucking game.
It is. I put a lot of time into it, as I've said, so I'm committed.
You made it good. Fantastic. Now it's time to raid High Shelf Gaming Panel, all things Dark and Cyberpunk, with Mike Pondsmith, James Hutt, and Jay Gray of Artelsorian Games, the ones, the onlys, at Gen Con Online. Thank you very much. We'll see you very soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.